All right, good morning. Welcome to a quick Wednesday review of the Cold War, at least the early Cold War. I'm going to cover pretty much up through 1970. Just want to do a quick review video as promised. I had mentioned this last week that if we did not have school for whatever reason, then I would be more than happy to throw up a video for you guys while you are working on all of the work that has been uploaded for you. So without further ado, first and foremost, I hope everyone is doing well, you and your families. I am praying for all of you as we continue to work through this coronavirus drama and pray for your peace and safety. So let's get started. All right. So you should be able to come up with a general working definition of the Cold War, and you should know who their major players are. As far as the definition, there's really no one particular definition. It is a war of ideas, or it's an ideological war between democracy and communism. You should know what those terms mean. Between command economy versus capitalism. The important thing to remember about the Cold War is that it is really a war of ideas that does not involve military action, direct military action, between the United States and the Soviet Union, who are, of course, the two major players. They are the two superpowers who emerge at the end of World War II, which really is the beginning of the Cold War. We are the two strongest nations on the planet, and the Soviet Union is actually more or less almost like a modern-day empire, as opposed to the United States, who is simply a country. In addition to the United States and the Soviet Union, the United Nations, I have to mention them as a major player because remember from our past studies, Woodrow Wilson created the League of Nations. His whole vision was that we would create this League of Nations where instead of fighting, instead of military action, we would have diplomacy. We would be able to talk out our issues so that no one would have to lose their life in a silly battle. But the League of Nations fell apart primarily because the United States was not involved. Remember, the Senate refused to approve that part of the Treaty of Versailles, and ultimately the League of Nations had no power. And we see that, of course, when you see the rise of the three-headed monster, when you see Japan invading Manchuria in 1931, and there's really nothing that the League of Nations can do. But the United Nations, which emerges around 1948. The United Nations is important because this time, one, the United States is very much involved in the organization, and number two, it is based in New York City, and it still is today, thus assuring the United States involvement. And it is still doing its job today, still seeking ways to prevent wars. And we've not had a world war since. We've certainly had many a conflict, but we have not had a global war on the scale of a World War I or a World War II. Another major player, of course, is President Harry S. Truman, who takes over after the death of FDR. FDR dies in the middle of his fourth term. Harry S. Truman assumes the presidency, not knowing a thing about the atomic bomb. He, of course, is going to be the one who decides to drop it. And really, it's going to be the beginning of the nuclear age, and he's going to have to deal with Stalin and some of the Cold War realities of post-World War II life in the world. The last two gentlemen whose names I have up here, these two, Nikita Khrushchev, who it will be the successor to Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, and then JFK, who would become president of the United States in 1961. These two square off in some very famous or infamous moments. One of them being the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we're on the brink of war. I'm going to save my comments on that for later. But these two figures are known for almost escalating the Cold War on some levels. And of course, that's going to impact other countries. So keep those people in mind. And Harry S. Truman for our purposes in world history, is really important because of some of the things that he comes up with. So let's get to that. What are some important Cold War key terms that you guys have to know? You need to know the arms race. Remember, the moment the United States drops that atomic bomb, there is a race to produce a deadlier weapon than what the United States has. And that means you're going to need technology. That means you're going to need scientists and so forth. And so there's this race to essentially accumulate weapons, which, if we remember correctly, is one of the reasons why we had World War One. This whole militarism. We're accumulating weapons, and each side has their own weapons, and now we have another mess again. The Truman Doctrine. Now, I said this a few minutes ago in talking about Harry S. Truman, a very important figure. Truman's doctrine was very simple. We have got to deal with Stalin and the Soviet Union. We've got to neutralize them. That's his whole doctrine or teaching, and the way he's going to do that is containment. The goal of containment, and I promise you I'm going to put this on a test, the goal of containment is to prevent the spread of communism. Period. However we do it, that's the goal of containment. That's part of the Truman Doctrine. The Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall, remember, is the symbol of the Cold War. Stalin has it built to divide East Germany from West Germany. East Germany, of course, is controlled by the Soviets. West Germany, of course, is going to become a democracy whose allies will be the United States, France, Great Britain, and so on and so forth. Then there is MAD, or Mutually Assured Destruction. This principle is the one thing that prevents, I think, a nuclear war. And all it means is this. Two sides in a battle who have the same nuclear capabilities knows that if one of them releases nuclear warheads to destroy the other country or territory, that the other side, knowing that it's going to die, says, you know what? Why should we be the only ones to die? We're going to release ours too, and then you're going to die too. So, keeping that in mind, two sides in a conflict say it's not worth it, and then they never get that far. That's the United States and the Soviet Union. That's going to be tested when we get to some other moments in the Cold War, but that is essentially what keeps us from a nuclear war. And then there's the domino theory. The domino theory basically states this, and this is something that becomes really important during the Vietnam War, which we're going to talk about. The domino theory basically says if one country in a given area falls to communism, then all of those neighboring countries around it will also become communist. So we have to prevent the spread of communism within a country. That's pretty much it. And that's what's going to drive much of the foreign policy of the United States, along with containment, of course. They work hand in hand. They are slightly different, but they're going to really heavily influence the foreign policy decisions of the United States. So, next question. How did the Cold War influence or shape certain powerful nations? When you think about the Cold War, I'm going to actually start with China. And I need to start with China because China is a little bit different from the Soviet Union. Oh gosh, let me stop saying that's driving me crazy. China is different from the Soviet Union, and some of that has to do, I believe, with cultural issues. Remember from our studies a few months ago when we talked about imperialism and we talked about the fact that China was carved up by European nations, and for a time there in the 19th century and early 20th century, they didn't really have control over their own land. Well, when Mao Zedong, who is pictured right here, this is Mao, when Mao Zedong becomes the leader of China, He turns China into a communist nation, and they remain a communist nation. That has not changed. Okay? And he does that by appealing to the poor people. He redistributes the land so that they can have land to live on, and they love it. They did not like the democratic-backed government of Chiang Kai-shek, who I think is known by another name. I think Xing Zhang. I can't never say that guy's name, but you'll see it in the notes. They didn't appreciate the corruption that they saw there, so of course they're going to embrace communism. The thing is, though, that China will become a totalitarian state, and I don't have to tell you what totalitarianism is. He becomes a totalitarian leader, and China will become a totalitarian communist country. And there are a few things that you need to remember about China. One, under Mao, they are going to practice this thing called collectivization. Basically, they pool the peasants' land and the labor. And the purpose is to become, more efficient, to produce more. They nationalize all the businesses. The schools are taught to praise the leaders. Does this sound familiar, guys? Does this sound like Mussolini? You have to be able to make those connections. And then they launched this program called the Great Leap Forward. You need to know that. I promise you, it will be on your region in June. I guarantee it. Okay? The Great Leap Forward. And the purpose, along with collectivization, was to increase factory production. Well, guess what happens? The opposite happens. And the project basically fails. People start starving because production is not that. It's not that. There's very little production. In fact, it's not very efficient. And so people starve, essentially. And of course, there are uprisings. People are upset. So Mao decides to launch this newer program called the Cultural Revolution. That's another one of those terms that New York State likes to throw in their regions, called the Cultural Revolution. And it's launched in 1966, and basically it was designed to force people to renew their loyalties to the communist government. That's pretty much it. And it's at that point that China isolates itself from really the rest of the world. People are afraid of being arrested. You have civil war threats within. And I think that's one of the reasons why their relationship with the Soviet Union is so complex. China does modernize, and Stalin even sends some money to them for aid, but their ideologies are just different. And the Soviet Union cannot control China. And I think Stalin recognized that. And so guess what happens? The Soviet Union takes back their aid, and they take back their advisors. And China's relationship with the United States is even more complicated, which we'll talk about that in another topic or a chapter. Remember, the United States has supported the other regime, the Democratic quote mark regime, the one that the people hated because they thought they were corrupt. So to have to deal with Mao, and I'm saying Mao because in China, in Chinese culture, the name that looks like the first name to us is actually his last name. So I'm not being disrespectful. Mao and the communists were considered enemies, if you look at it from a political standpoint. That's going to break in the 1970s. This is the side information. When President Nixon will be the first president to establish diplomatic relations with China. Okay? Which, in our next video, is going to bring us to the complicated relations or impacts of the Cold War on the United States. The next video, we're going to finish up talking about China and the United States and the Soviet Union and the global impact of the Cold War policies, particularly that the United States has embarked upon. Even though this is world history, it feels like U.S. history for a little bit, but it is very necessary that we go through this. So I'm going to end part 1 and then make sure you click on part 2.